I'm going to pass over to Camille Girard from France, from NouesFemmes, WHRC France. Over to you, Camille.
I will give you a summary of the second French-speaking webinar with the panelists from Quebec, Andorra, Switzerland, and France. The situation being, Stéphane Mitchell from Switzerland gave us a summary about how the WHRC founders created the sex-based declaration, for we are facing an erasure of the notion of sex in law in favor of the concept of gender identity politics and how it affects women and girls. So Clémence was a panelist from Quebec. She told us about the Moore case, and I found an article which I will quote. So in Quebec, a judge, Gregory Moore, he invalidated several articles in the Civil Code, including the one that prevents a person from changing the sex listed and the list act of birth to reflect their gender identity. So he also struck down the provision that requires someone to be identified as a mother or a father on a declaration of birth, rather than being referred to as a parent. So according to the judge, the limitations of the Civil Code deprive trans and non-binary people of the dignity and equality that they are owed. The judge gave the province until the end of the year to amend the Civil Code. The Center for Gender Advocacy called the decision an important victory for the rights of non-binary individuals, trans parents, trans non-citizens, and trans youth. So the fight for justice and ensuring legal protection of all intersex, trans, and non-binary people is ongoing, and there clearly remains much work to do and to be done. The judge also ruled that people should be allowed to change their gender designation, even if they are not Canadian citizens, opening the door to permanent residents, refugees, and people without status. However, underage people still need to provide a letter from a physician, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, sexologist, or social worker if they want to change their gender civil status. So Clémence said that these changes in the law leave us with questions we can't answer yet, like what about the meaning of being a mother? The fact it changed the past of a child. What about if both parents disagree? What about the trans people? And also Quebec wants to make surrogacy a legal thing, and this ruling will make it easier. Then we had the panelist from Andorra, who wanted to remain anonymous, and she reported the situation in her country. So Andorra is a small country which belongs to Spain and France. It's a kind of parliamentary monarchy, a co-principality between the Bishop of Urgell in Catalonia and the President of France. In Andorra, abortion is illegal. Women need to go to France or Catalonia if they can afford it. And even in case of rape, if the fetus is abnormal or if the mother's health is in danger. Now a woman is facing a retaliation for reporting the situation of women in Andorra. Despite she is not breaking the law, she is facing 4 years in jail. Until these days, there is no possibility to change the sex in the Civil Code, but this might change. And the press is saying that a parental consent might be enough for underage children to change their sex in civil status. For adults, we don't know yet. The bishop doesn't seem to disagree with this, as gender identity is already ruled by law to protect children from gender discrimination and the right to gender identity and gender expression. There is also a law to rule equality and to prevent sexism based on sex and discrimination against female gender and gender identity expression. So what we can say is Andorra society takes gender identity more seriously than women's rights. Gender identity is brought into the media, school and university. So in Andorra, abortion is still illegal. Feminists can face jail. There is no possibility to change your sex in law yet, but law is replacing sex with gender and gender identity. Then we had Chandra from Switzerland. She made a summary of the situation of women and girls' rights in Switzerland. She spoke about the 2019 women's strike, which was inclusive as for the adding an asterisk at the word women to include women presenting as men presenting as women. In Switzerland, women can vote and be elected to parliament since 40 years and were given parental authority in 78. Sex-based equality was ruled 3 years later. So in oh boy, I forgot the word in French. In 1991, the first women's strike happened because the sex-based equality law was already 10 years old, but wasn't applied. Switzerland agreed to legal abortion in 2002, which is quite recent. In 2012, female genitation were illegal. Before it wasn't. Okay, the 2019 general strike was trans inclusive. Only cisgender men were unwelcomed. This year's feminist strike was less and less focused on women's rights, and even lesbian organizations are trans inclusive. So in Switzerland, like in many countries, women's rights and LGBT rights are mixed up. Gender identity was introduced in school and sports 10 years ago. About 5 years ago, they agreed to ease the sex change in civil status. And last year, they were preparing a new law for this year that will allow people, including underage children of 16-year-old. Actually, adults and 16-year-old teens, they can self-ID now. And there even was a debate about lowering the age to 12-year-old. To this day, a man who changes his sex in law remains a father. It doesn't become the mother. But gender identity is well set in school system, sometimes without telling it to the family. It's also set in medical area. Medical students are taught that sex is a spectrum, and media also promote gender identity. In France, we had Florence Imbert, a member of the Women's Assembly and French WHRC. So Florence, she focused on a material definition of sex and gender as a social construction and hierarchical system. She said the fight for human rights implies an end to gender hierarchy as a result of male supremacy, aka patriarchy. The acknowledgement of the existence of a magical feminine essence is a patriarchal myth to justify misogyny and has nothing to do with female biology. She explains that the concept of feminine essence or inner feelings bring us back 200 years ago, when male physicians used to dissect women's brains in order to find this so-called feminine essence and justify gender roles as being a natural thing. So since then, studies have proved many times, including with neurobiology, the inexistence of magical feminine essence, and that there is no such a thing as a female or a male brain. So it's about socio-cultural context. Patriarchy rules in a heterosexual system that discriminates women and lesbians for being gender non-conforming due to their sexual orientation. Lesbianism is a transgression of women's submission in patriarchy, and gays also transgress the male domination. Gender activists try to make us believe that being transgender is also about transgression, but it's not. Gender identity doesn't free people from gender roles, it worsens stereotypes, since transgenderism is about changing the body to match with the inner feeling of a gender identity. So there is a strong link between gender identity and gender roles, since patriarchy is based on a dichotomy between male domination and female submission. And this brings us back to the concept of a magical feminine essence, which doesn't exist. Gender ideology wants to base specific human rights on the inner and subjective concept of gender identity. So what changed in law in France? In 1992, a European Court of Justice condemned France for French law was seen as disrespectful. Back then, transsexuals reported that the assessments they were going through were intrusive and degrading. About 10 years ago, France removed transsexualism from the psychiatric illness list, which made the country the first to stop to see it as a pathology. So since transsexualism or gender dysphoria is no longer seen as an illness, there is no need to medicalize it. So there were no reason to keep it in the French healthcare system anymore. But trans activists succeeded in keeping that way. So what I want to say is transsexualism is not an illness anymore, but it still is seen as a long-term illness and it's supported by the healthcare system, which is quite weird. So Florence reminds us that gender dysphoria is made up from gender stereotypes, and being gender non-conforming is now pathological. But trans activists refuse the medicalization of gender dysphoria since psychiatric approach is seen as degrading, while they demand that the healthcare system support this non-illness. So gender identity is a inner feeling of being part of the opposite sex or not, and this feeling must not be seen as a pathology, but still must be taken care of long-term illness by society. She also said that now in France, if an adult or an emancipated child wants to change the sex in law, all she or he needs is produce an assessment from family, friends, or co-workers. And Florence, she made it well when she said, in English, the clothes do not make the man, but for trans activists, they make the woman, which is, yeah, it's clear. Then we have the privilege to have Michelle Vianès with us. She is the president of the French association Regard de Femmes, and she tells us more about the Yoga Carta principle and why they are already in French law without the knowledge of French people, since there were never a public debate about public discussion about it. So she said, how was it possible, since French law requires a public debate, how is it possible that France endorses such principles as, for example, they're giving more credibility to a man than a woman, since a man can declare himself that he is a woman and have access to women-specific accommodation like lockers, toilets, and jails, and how it is linked to trans activist ideology. So, of course, there is a calling for compassion, but also from a part of gender activists, they will attack anyone who will disagree, and mostly women and lesbians, and they are using language and law as a double strategy to do it. So at the beginning, discrimination against women has a sex-based legal approach. Then there were an amendment, who offers the same protection to transgender people. For example, the law about sports access this year. In French law, gender identity is put before age and disability. And this is how this year the French Rugby Federation endorses men presenting as women in French rugby. And this takes place after the International Rugby Federation ruled that men presenting as women shouldn't compete with women based on security and fairness. In France, we had our first jail case. A man succeeded in being sent in a women's jail by a legal procedure, thanks to the 2016 law. Until now, only transsexuals who had surgery were sent in a women's jail in France. So, of course, the prison guards, they protested through the syndicate, as they were told to body search a male inmate, because French law says that body searching requires a same-sex approach. In France, there is a law at the Assembly, and they want to penalize parents who doesn't support transgender kids, and this could be seen as an act of torture if you don't support your kid if she or he is trans. So this is very important to say because it's just, well, it's so wrong actually. They also want to remove the mention of sex in the act of birth. We talk about Marion Miller too in France. And what we are doing now is we are joining together to strike back and defend ourselves and support each other. And NouesFemmes is this is our aim.